Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I'm your host, Ronojoy Sen, a senior research fellow at the Institute. There is a controversy brewing around the delimitation of constituencies in India's lower house of parliament, or the Lok Sabha, which is scheduled for 2026. The southern states of India, in particular, are fearing a loss of seats and political power if the redrawing of electoral seats is done based solely on population figures. The number of seats in Indian parliament has been increased thrice based on the decennial census since the country's independence. The last time it happened, though, was way back in 1972, following the 1971 census, when the number of seats in the Lok Sabha was fixed at 543 for a population at the time of roughly 548 million, which has, of course, subsequently increased to 1.4 billion plus. Since then, the number has been kept constant partly in order to encourage population control measures. To talk about the intricacies of the delimitation process, we have with us Dr. Milan Vaishnav. Dr. Vaishnav is a senior fellow and director of the South Asia program and the host of the very popular Grand Tamasha podcast at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His primary research focus is the political economy of India, and he examines issues such as corruption and governance, state capacity, distributive politics, and electoral behavior. He also conducts research on the Indian diaspora. He's the author of When Crime Pays, Money and Muscle in Indian Politics, published by the Yale University Press in 2017. He's also the co-editor with Devesh Kapoor of Costs of Democracy, Political Finance in India, and with Pratap Bhanu Mehta and Devesh Kapoor of Rethinking Public Institutions in India. His work has been extensively published in several scholarly journals. He holds a PhD in political science from Columbia University. Welcome, Milan, to the show.
Thank you, Ron. It's great to be here.
So let me begin with a sort of a basic question. So could you briefly explain to a lay audience the importance of the delimitation in India that's scheduled for 2026?
Yeah. It's a good place to start, I think. I mean, I think it's important to keep in mind for your listeners what is at stake, right? And what is at stake in this process we call delimitation, what other countries call, redistricting, is really the future of how ordinary Indians will be represented in parliament, right? So it gets at the kind of very essence of what it means to be a kind of representative democratic republic. Now, if you consult the Indian Constitution, there's an article, Article 81, which requires that each state in the Union receive seats in proportion to its population, and then within the state allocates those seats to constituencies of roughly equal size, right? The subsequent article, the Constitution, Article 82, calls for the reallocation of these seats after every decennial census based on updated population figures, right? So most of your listeners will know in years ending with a 1, 1931, 1941, 1951, so on and so forth, there is typically an Indian census held. However, there were some pretty fundamental alterations made to the Constitution going back to the 1970s and the time of Indira Gandhi. Parliament at that point passed the 42nd Amendment, which essentially suspended the revision of seats across states until after the 2001 census. And one major reason or impetus for this freeze was Indira Gandhi's desire to promote family planning policies, right? You did not want to penalize states that got their fertility rates down. And put in place solid kind of population control measures by essentially taking away political power. So by freezing this, you said, okay, whatever the lay of the land is as of the 1971 census, we're going to let that continue until 2001. Now, when it came time to essentially unfreeze this, Parliament said, no, 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 we're going to delay this even further. They passed the 84th Amendment in 2002, which extended this freeze until the next census after 2026. So normally that would take place in 2031. Now we're in a bit of a strange situation because the 2021 census, which would have been the most recent census, was never carried out. And we can get into some of the complexities around that. But we're all waiting essentially for an announcement from government about a new census and then how they are going to tackle this redistricting, which again, after 2026, this freeze will become undone. And you can imagine in the intervening decades, the population growth rates, the population composition of India states has changed massively since 1971, right? So, which would mean there would be a dramatic reallocation of political power once you actually took this new data into account.
Right. So you mentioned the decennial census, and we don't yet have the findings of the 2021 census, and we are not really sure about the status of that census. So, given that context, does delimitation look possible at all in 2026?
I don't think so. Just to refresh your kind of listeners' minds, again, we were supposed to have a decennial census in 2021 that was initially delayed because of the COVID-19 pandemic, which I think, was seems like a reasonable excuse. Obviously, it's very hard to do a house to house enumeration of the entire population of 1.4 billion people. But many other countries subsequently, in the past 4 years, even those who delayed their censuses have done them, but India has not. Last September in 2024, the Home Minister Amit Shah had stated that the government would begin conducting the census very soon. Unfortunately, we haven't seen much of an update since that. I think one of the sticking points is likely to be how to deal with this thorny issue of caste. There are many opposition parties, including the Indian National Congress, which is the principal national opposition party, which has said if you are going to do a census, you should also collect very detailed information on the caste composition of the Indian society at large. That's not something which has been done at a granular level since 1931. There was an effort in 2011 to collect caste data. That was never released to the public. The government said that the data was incomplete, it couldn't be trusted. And so it seems very unlikely to me, Ronojoy, given how massive an undertaking an Indian census is, that this could be done by 2026. I think, most experts suggest that even if they announced a timetable today, we would likely see the soonest we could see a delimitation would probably be around 2028.
Right. So, moving beyond the logistics of the delimitation as well as the census, why are the southern states so worried about the proposed delimitation? And how does it play into questions on the representation ratio that you talked about in Indian Parliament?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, going back to one of Mrs. Gandhi's underlying motivations for the freeze was this idea that there are certain states which have managed to reduce fertility, which have managed to implement family planning and other population control measures. As it happens, many of those states were located in the southern peninsula, the southern half of the Indian subcontinent. And so but representation, of course, has not changed in kind with the population or demographic trends. So the ultimate outcome we have is severely unequal representation. You have more populous northern states, which are dramatically underrepresented in parliament, and you have less populous or southern states and whose population growth is slowing, who are overrepresented. Now, I just want to caution that the current context really goes beyond just political representation because there are a set of other inextricably connected issues which are layered on top of this political question. Many of the most prosperous states also are in the South. They feel like they are taxed at a very high rate, but they're not necessarily getting equivalent funds back from the center through India's system of kind of fiscal federalism, fiscal transfers. We see a lot of interstate migration taking place where, again, migrants from poor northern or eastern states are migrating to places in the south where there are more jobs available, and again, where they have a more aging population, that's created all kinds of tensions around reservations, about jobs, about the economy, about kind of internal displacement. And so, what does this mean in a concrete sense? So, one of the things we did was to essentially try and use the 2001 and 2011 census to project what state population figures might look like in 2026, to get a sense of how severe this issue of malapportionment is by the time next year that this freeze expires, right? And what we find when we do that is is really sizable shifts in political power, right? So in 2026, for instance, just two states, Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, alone would gain 21 seats, right? And this is out of a parliament of 543, while Kerala and Tamil Nadu, two significant southern states, would forfeit as many as 16 or 17 seats, right? And so those are the kind of starkest examples, and of course, there's many gradations in between. But that would represent if we were to follow a simple one person, one vote rule, which tends to be the norm in in democratic legislatures, that would mean just a redrawing of the political map in India.
Right. I know you've kind of been the pioneer in doing some of these calculations, and you've looked at the projected population, etc. So, what are the solutions that are being proposed? I know the government hasn't committed to one yet,
Yeah.
but what do you think are the sort of range of solutions that one could look at?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think there are probably sort of four big categories of solutions, and maybe it's just worth kind of quickly going through each of them. I think the first, obviously, is just to kick the can down the road and to say
Right.
we
Yeah.
don't want to touch this tinderbox because it's so politically explosive that we will again pass a constitutional amendment, kick the can down the road another 20 or
Essentially
25
extend the
years,
freeze.
which is has already been done in as I mentioned in 2002. So that would just extend the freeze. I'm not sure that that's going to be feasible, just because the the states are so animated about this, particularly the states who feel they've been underrepresented, that they may not be willing to kind of go along. But of course, it is a possibility. A second possibility is just to commit to a one person, one vote reallocation after 2026. Resist the urge to kick the can down the road. This is kind of what I've called the pulling off the band-aid strategy, right? You just do it in one go. You take your political lumps, and you force states to leave to live in a new reality. That again is going to be very hard because we have already seen the southern states foreshadow their opposition to anything that is as drastic as that. So what are the kind of in between options, right? Which is arguably probably where we're most likely to head. So a third possibility is essentially to expand the size of the Lok Sabha, right? And that might be more politically feasible than simply reapportioning the current number of seats on a one person, one vote kind of design. And the idea here is you expand the Lok Sabha enough so that the most overrepresented state does not lose any seats under reapportionment, right? So, yes, the states like Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, which have been underrepresented, would gain a lot of seats, excuse me. But a state like Kerala, for instance, it wouldn't gain any, but it also wouldn't lose any. It has 20 seats and it would stay at 120 seats. Now, Uttar Pradesh would go from 80 to 143, but that would at least you would be able to say to the South, okay, we're not taking anything away. Uh, but if you do that, if no state is to lose representation, the Lok Sabha would have to consist of, according to our numbers, and these could, change once we get hard population figures, would have to consist of 848 representatives, right? Which is 300 plus more than what exists today. That would be, I think, the largest composition of any lower house in any democratic country today. A final solution, I should just point out, this is not mutually exclusive. This could be done in conjunction with with tinkering with the lower house is you could take aim at trying to reform the upper house, right? So as your listeners would know, the Rajya Sabha is seats are proportionally allocated to states on the basis of their population, but the members are indirectly elected by the state legislatures, right? And the Rajya Sabha has meant to serve as a council of states. In practice, it hasn't done so, and I would refer people to your book, Ronojoy, which talks about why it hasn't done so. But in essence, it's become a kind of upper house with a very loose connection to states' interests or states' rights, right? So there are a couple of things that you could do to reform the Rajya Sabha that might give the southern states some reassurance, right? So, for instance, one is if you really wanted a genuine upper house that argued for states' interests, you could enforce, which has been taken away, that there must be what's known as a domicile requirement. If you are a Rajya Sabha representative from Karnataka, you must truly be a resident of that state. Those ties between Rajya Sabha members and their states have been completely wiped away. The second is to do essentially what the U.S. Senate eventually did, which was to move from a system of indirect election to direct election, right? So to try and bind these people closer to the populations that they represent. And a third thing you could do is just fix the number of seats across states, again, like the US Senate has done, which is to say, it doesn't matter if you're Wyoming, where very few people live, or California, where a lot of people live, you're going to get two Senate seats, Wyoming, and you're going to get two Senate seats, California. And so then that reduces, I think, the southern states' apprehensions because Uttar Pradesh won't be proportionally more represented than, say, a Tamil Nadu or an Andhra Pradesh or a Telangana, right? So if you wanted to play with the lower house, there's nothing stopping you from also tinkering with the composition and the rules governing the upper house, right? So I think these reflect probably the three or four big kind of possibilities that are likely to be on the table. And again, just to say one final word, I think we're in a world where if you're going to take on this question of political reallocation and malapportionment and representation, it will be very hard to do unless you do it in conjunction with taking on questions of fiscal federalism, of tax devolution, of migration, those other cross-state issues I mentioned, right? So we're really set up for potentially what could be a very interesting and innovative grand bargain where the center and the states come together to hash out a compromise. I've made the analogy in the past that something akin to the kind of states reorganization commission of the 1950s, where you take a holistic view of trying to solve a set of very thorny problems in Indian federalism. So we don't have any indication yet, as you rightly pointed out, which solution the government would go for. But I think these are the ones which I think are amongst the most prominent.
Right. Yeah. So thanks for that overview of the solutions that can potentially be on the table, and also the important point that we shouldn't be seeing delimitation in isolation. It should be seen in conjunction with several other things that you mentioned. Thank you, Milan, for sharing your insights on South Asia Chat. You were listening to South Asia Chat. To learn more about our work, please visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates through social media. We are on X, or Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. South Asia Chat is also on Spotify and Apple Podcast.